What's up guys and girls, welcome to the channel. I'm gonna be talking about Resident Evil 8 today. So this isn't from an official source, I'm not covering any news or anything as usual. Today I'm just gonna be speculating over what I personally want for Resident Evil 8. I've been kind of a little bit quiet about these topics, if you would. I've been covering a lot of news lately, but not really making any videos that had my own personal thoughts on them, and I've been kind of missing making those videos. I'm not sure why I stopped, but I thought, you know what, this is a perfect opportunity. I had a lot of thoughts recently about Resident Evil 8 with them talking about it, and this is just a really good opportunity to exploit, so let's get into it. Now, the basis of this video is going to be Resident Evil 7 in a way, because honestly I'm going to take the foundation of Resident Evil 7 as I think it was an exceptional game in a lot of the way it was executed, and I want to use that as the foundation that we improve upon. Now keep in mind, Resident Evil 8 will definitely be a sequel. This is how the entire main franchise has always worked. Now the first thing I want to say is Resident Evil 7, it just completely pulled me back into that feeling of survival horror, and I'm sure a lot of people can understand why, but I still want to give off some specific reasons. First off, the run speed, the way that was gimped to such a low amount, that made the experience incredible. I'd honestly say in Resident Evil 8 they need to try and emulate that, slow down the character's speed a hell of a lot, do not allow us to infinitely sprint, because these things definitely add to the immersion and they just make you panic a hell of a lot more. I also like the blocking system in Resident Evil 7 a lot more than the other Resident Evils. Some of them had some very clunky mechanics, but I feel like 7 got it down really well, and honestly you could work a very similar blocking system into any kind of camera view. This is like the only lifeline you have, and blocking does need to work well if you're going to have a slow pace of movement to allow you to actually get through the environment. I also really like the dodge mechanic in Revelations 1, that was like a good way of nullifying the enemy's damage. But it felt a little bit more clunkier than Resident Evil 7, and Resident Evil 7 I felt like had the most fluidity to the system. Now talking about the camera view, I know this is a really debated topic, but I'd honestly say Resident Evil 4 made a great and genius adaptation to the camera. Now, I'm not saying Resident Evil 1 and 3 had bad camera views, trust me guys, I'm an old fan and I really do adore the old camera views. But at this point, Resident Evil is a very diverse franchise. I'd say the older style camera views should be kept to remakes, remasters and spin-offs, and actually the diversity should increase as the series develops. That will keep it very healthy. So what I would say is maybe do a hybrid of Resident Evil 4 to 6's camera, but with Resident Evil 7, almost like a Bethesda game where you can go between first person and third person at will. You'd be able to produce the game around that quite well, and it'd fit both fans perfectly. I know out there are a lot of people that appreciate first person regardless of the game that it is implemented into. Back when GTA implemented first person, a lot of my friends and myself were using that exclusively, and it just adds a whole new layer of fun and immersiveness to the game, and a whole new layer of freshness that you didn't get to experience before. This also does have the added value of having more retention, because you can do two separate playstyles in both the camera views, and even if there was no change to the gameplay, that in itself is such a massive change that it does feel fresh enough. The weapons in Resident Evil 8 I think need to be a bit more diverse again. Actually, Resident Evil 7 really did follow the old games in this formula because it had a very lackluster amount of weapons. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have a weapon for each situation. Trust me, there was enough variety in Resident Evil 7 to cover every angle. It's just that the other Resident Evils since 4 seem to have gone all in on the amount of weapons and customization you had available to you. And being a huge military nerd, I really appreciated that you could have the ability to customize your loadout to the specific situation that you wanted, or you could just choose guns for purely aesthetic reasons. It doesn't really matter which way you want to go, that's your choice, and that was what was nice, you had a choice about it. I think most people who took Resident Evil 7 seriously or did want to enjoy the game had a very limited amount of weapons they could use, whereas in previous Resident Evil since 4 you actually had a diverse amount of weaponry available to you even at the more powerful tiers. And then comes in the customization that was also removed from Resident Evil 7, and that would be a greatly appreciated feature to make a comeback as well. I'd actually like the customization to be elaborated upon instead of just being a simple upgrade system that seems very linear. I'd rather have it so there's trade-offs, you know, like you can have a compensator or a silencer instead of just getting damage, reload speed, etc. Just straight up stat upgrades, to be quite fair. Having an attachment system with some kind of trade-off stat system I think would add more to the diversity again. It'd allow different playstyles, and again it just add a little bit more retention to the game and replay value overall. Now, considering that Resident Evil 7 was a first-person game, I can understand why this feature was not in place. But I'd definitely like to see the customizable outfits back in there if we do have a third-person camera, which is more than likely to occur, so don't forget about the feature. Honestly, customization of the appearance was something that actually added a lot to the game, and I know the modding community had a lot of customization options they developed, and that kind of proves the point about how passionate some individuals are about that. Now, getting more into the general gameplay mechanics, to be honest, I want to get into a few things. Now, nothing in this list has actually been in any particular order, just keep that in mind, but I'll just talk about the bosses for now, because bosses in Resident Evil 7 were a little bit underwhelming in my opinion. So first off, we have the Mia fight in the attic, and honestly speaking, it was almost more like a tutorial boss than anything else. It was pretty easy to fight, there was not much challenge, there was not much complexity, there was no additional things to do. The only thing I knew that you could actually do that changed the combat environment up was allow Mia to chainsaw through a wall, which opened up an additional extra route to go through, and that was about it. It just opened up an ability to circle around the attic. There's been some fights in Resident Evil in the past where you could do things to the scenery, or you could change things in the environment, and that would allow you more options and additions, but in Resident Evil 7 they really simplified this. And then talking about the bosses themselves, like I said, in previous Resident Evils you'd have, let's say for example, weak spots and stuff you'd have to target, or specific ways to take them down. They did kind of do this with the final Jack boss fight, but honestly speaking the other fights would just almost do as much damage as possible. And again, I think that the complexity from previous Resident Evils was more appreciated. You had to do specific tactics and strategies. Don't get me wrong, there's also some bullet sponge boss fights here and there throughout the whole series, but it wasn't the main focus of the bosses throughout the games. Having to almost solve a mini puzzle while you're fighting a boss is what made it so thrilling. That's what it really is, to be honest. It's like a puzzle but where you're constantly fighting, and that's where the adrenaline rush comes in and what makes the game so scary. And on that note, you know, the puzzles could also do with an improvement, to be honest. Now, the puzzles in Resident Evil 7 were a little mixed. Some were actually okay, but some were really easy. Like, just to give you some examples, the birthday puzzle was okay in complexity if you hadn't watched the tape, for example. Even then you might get a little bit confused. I did in my playstyle, but to be honest it's not going to catch you out for too long. Whereas the shadow puzzles are just completely easy and they made up the bulk of the puzzles, so that kind of ruined the game in one way, to be honest, the fact that the puzzles weren't as good. And in Resident Evil 8 they should bring back the really complex puzzles, the ones that really do make you think. I mean, even Resident Evil 5 had some really good puzzles compared to Resident Evil 7. I did appreciate they brought the crank back, and that was again a good nod back to the older games, but again the way you had to use it was quite simple and obvious. I just hope Resident Evil 8 does go back to that formula of more complex puzzles. It does seem to have been lost in the series lately. Now, talking about the atmosphere of Resident Evil 7, because the atmospheric noise in the environment was so well crafted, and that's one of the things that I think the game performed the best at. You constantly heard wind noises, you could hear the little creaks throughout the house. Like, at certain points, and I know most people can agree with me, you were literally unsure whether you were being followed by Jack or another one of the bakers or a molded, or whether it was just the household noises, and you'd sit there and you'd hear more creaking, and it just freaked you out. And that's how good the atmospheric noises was. You then figured out it was just the atmosphere. That's exceptional. there is really honestly very few games that have achieved that level of atmospheric quality. Now, the handcrafted environments were also really good. Each room did tell a story. It gave off the baker's ambience and livelihood really well. The way the house was decorated, like the football medals for Jack, they just told little significant parts of the characters and added to that. Now, that's a really good way to design an environment. Mix this with the atmosphere and the craziness. Like I said, they just really need to keep that design. Whoever designed those rooms and whoever placed the sounds how they did, they knew their job to a perfection. I don't think I'm the only one that thinks, by the way, ammo wasn't as scarce in Resident Evil 7 as I expected it to be. So I would say Resident Evil 1 through 3 had moments where if you wasted your ammo like you just didn't care, you would get bit for that. There was some severe punishment. But in Resident Evil 7, I almost felt like I could deplete my ammunition as much as I pleased. I mean, there were several moments early game where ammunition was rare, but as you got into the pace of it, that glory and conservation just kind of disappeared. The amount of ammunition that was thrown at you was ludicrous, to be honest. And so in Resident Evil 8, they need to go back into the ammunition, take a look at the numbers, how they spawn it, how many enemies are around, how many bullets they usually take to kill, what guns the player has available to them at the time, and they need to redesign it so that the ammunition is given to you in sparse amounts, enough to get you around. But I do think the player should be forced to skip a few enemies per area just to ensure they have ammo conservation and can continue to defend themselves when they actually need it. You know, you shouldn't be going into a boss fight and you've actually got 250 bullets available to you. I don't really think that fits the definition of scarce ammunition very well. Now, dialogue and interaction between characters is always an essential part of Resident Evil. Although the core of the game is a survival horror, it's not like Dead Space 2 where you're alone constantly. Characters talk to each other, they interact, they unlock things together, they survive together. Cooperative action, even in the single player games between the NPCs, is very heavy. You are alone for most of the time, however, when those key times do happen, Resident Evil is not very well known for creating an authentic interaction between the characters. But if you take a look at Jack's moment, the tragic moment in Resident Evil 7 when he confesses everything to Ethan during that kind of hallucination.
Hey, shh, I know. I'm not gonna hurt you. Hell, I never would have if I could have helped you.
What do you mean?
I'm no killer, son. Neither is Marguerite, nor my boy Lucas, or even Zoe here.
The amount of character development and realism there was so unbelievable. It had me heart-wrenched that moment. I mean, honestly, I was pretty emotional and I really was feeling for Jack and his plights at that point. So I'd honestly say they need to keep that level of authenticity for Resident Evil 8. The facial animations and the voice actors were just exceptional. And this is one of the most essential points to get a player connected to the story, is to make strong, believable characters that you can feel a strong empathy for. That is so well executed in Resident Evil 7 for Jack, but some of the other characters just really failed on that. Zoe didn't really have that kind of emotional connection, to be quite fair, and that might have been her voice actor, it could have been the script that was wrote, it could have been a mix of both. But if you look at Lucas, for example, even though you don't really agree with Lucas throughout the story, you still feel a strong clicking connection to that character, and he's really well developed. I really do hope they keep this up and don't just go back to the cheesy, generic action lines that they have in the movies and the other games, because I was pleasantly surprised by this one. The last thing I'll say is Resident Evil 7 had very little of what you will call QuickTime events. Now, don't get me wrong, they had some variations in there, but QuickTime events seem to have kind of been phased out. Now, Resident Evil, as of late, if you take 7 out of the equation, had lots of QuickTime events. Resident Evil 4 had some QuickTime events. Resident Evil 5 had a lot of QuickTime events. And Resident Evil 6 was like QuickTime events central. This is something that a lot of fans will agree with, because I think almost nobody likes the QuickTime events, to be honest. There's a few people that don't care, but I really doubt anybody sits there going, oh yeah, I want QuickTime events in my games, I want my games to be full of QTEs. Resident Evil 8 should just continue the formula of omitting them as much as possible. Maybe have them in at a few parts in the game, not in actual usual QTE sequence. Take the final boss as an example in Resident Evil 7 when you get the pistol and you have to shoot her. I'd consider that a variation of a QuickTime event. You have no control and you have to do a specific action to win. If you don't do that one specific action, you lose. That fits the criteria pretty well, but you didn't have an annoying button flashing on screen and some stupid cinematic. Because of the fact of the seamless gameplay and lack of transition, I at least felt a little bit more immersed into it, so Resident Evil 8 should definitely follow up on that formula. Now guys, I'm sure there's things I haven't actually said here that you really want to get out, so remember, as always, post in the comments below your thoughts, what you think needs to be in Resident Evil 8 definitely, and we'll all discuss this below. If you liked the video, please leave a like and a subscribe. I have a Twitter that you can follow if you want to keep up to date as well, and there's a Discord server that's in the description. We have an active community there if you want to join and come talk to me and the community. Anyway guys, that's all I have to share for now. I hope you've had a good time. Have a beautiful day as always. Take it easy and peace.